Charleston, South Carolina, 1989. A young mother, 24-year-old Annie Tahan, disappeared without a trace. Her partner claimed that she had left him and their newborn daughter and simply left. The search for the missing woman took 4 long years. Annie Tahan was born on May 1, 1965. She was raised by her mother. The girl loved to dance, have fun, and just live life to the fullest. She always dreamed of having a large family, becoming a mother, and considered it her ultimate goal. Annie gave birth to her first son, Jamie, at the age of 18, and a year later, her second son, Sean, was born. At 20, she became a mother for the 3rd time, giving birth to her daughter, Shane. Unfortunately, their father abandoned Annie immediately after their daughter's birth. He took no part in raising the children and completely disowned them. Annie was left alone and lived in a rented apartment in the state of Maine. When her youngest daughter, Shane, turned 6 months old, in 1987, 22-year-old Annie met a new man. He was 32-year-old Michael Pollan, a senior chief petty officer in the U.S. Navy who was serving on the aircraft carrier Bramby at the time. His ship had docked in Portland, Maine, and on the waterfront, he met young Annie and became interested in her. Michael himself lived in Charleston, South Carolina. The man had an excellent reputation, working as a computer operator on the ship, participating in military actions, and even receiving several prestigious awards. Annie was extremely proud that Michael was a sailor, and she fell head over heels in love with him. She confided in a close friend that she had finally met a worthy man and was truly happy. Annie and Michael dated for a couple of months and then decided to live together. The man moved into Annie's apartment, and they began living together with her 2 sons and daughter from her previous relationships. Almost immediately after moving in, a fire broke out in the apartment. Annie was away at the time. At home were only Michael, her 2 older sons, Jamie and Sean, and her youngest daughter, Shane. Michael and the 2 older sons managed to escape the burning apartment, but the youngest daughter, Shane, who couldn't yet walk, remained inside. When Annie returned home, she tried to rush into the apartment to save her daughter, but neighbors held her back and prevented her from doing so. Shane died. The pain Annie felt after the tragedy was indescribable. She admitted that an enormous black hole would forever remain in her heart. When the police investigated the fire, experts could not agree on the source of the blaze. They considered the fire highly suspicious, but no one was held responsible for it. After the tragedy, Annie Tahan moved with her sons to her mother's private home in Portland. Michael Pollan threw himself into his work and lived in barracks. Just a few months later, another fire occurred near Annie's mother's house. This time, someone set fire to a shed in the backyard. The source of the fire was quickly found. Investigators discovered a lighter with the engraving Bramby in the debris. This was the name of the ship where Michael Pollan worked. He immediately became the prime suspect in the arson, but the police could not prove his guilt due to a lack of evidence. After the second fire, the state of Maine's Child Protective Services concluded that Annie Tahan was putting her sons in danger, and they needed to be removed from her care. The boys were placed in foster care. Annie desperately tried to regain custody of Jamie and Sean, but was unable to do so. Her heart was literally breaking from the impossibility of being with them. At that time, Michael Pollan's ship returned to Charleston, South Carolina. He settled in a rented apartment there and reconnected with Annie. She agreed to communicate with him and soon decided to move with him to Goose Creek, a suburb of Charleston. There, they began living together as a couple. However, Annie soon learned another shocking piece of news. In Michael's apartment, she found a photograph of him wearing a wedding ring. Annie immediately realized that the man was married. When Michael returned home, Annie asked him about the photo. Pollan admitted that he had been married but had long since divorced. He didn't hide the fact that his ex-wife, Dawn Breeze, lived with their 3 children in his mother's house in Savannah, Georgia. Michael repeatedly emphasized that he had no relationship with his ex-wife. After this revelation, Annie initially considered leaving Michael, But she quickly changed her mind because she still believed he was the perfect man and that they could build a good family together, starting fresh. However, after a few months of living together, Annie began to feel that Michael was becoming increasingly abusive towards her. She once again thought about leaving him. But unexpectedly, she found out that she was pregnant. The news of her pregnancy made her decide not to leave Michael. She was happy to be expecting a child. In October 1989, just a month before her disappearance, Annie Tahan gave birth to her fourth daughter, Jade. She said that Jade could never replace her deceased daughter, but her arrival filled the enormous void in her heart. Almost a month passed after the birth, and Michael's treatment of Annie only worsened. He verbally abused and humiliated her without restraint. Annie confided in a friend that she felt even if she ran away from home, Michael would find her and not leave her in peace. By that time, Michael was locking Annie in the apartment and not allowing her to leave while he was at work. He also unplugged the phone, put it in his briefcase, and took it to work with him. Annie was frightened by his behavior. 2 days before her disappearance, in a panic, Annie called her close friend Katie French and revealed that she had told Michael about her plans to leave him. He had responded by saying that their daughter, Jade, would stay with him and she would never see her again. Annie cried and pleaded over the phone, asking her friend to come and take her and her daughter away, but her friend was busy and couldn't come. Instead, she sent Annie money for a bus ticket so she could escape and return to her hometown of Portland. This was the end of their conversation. Neither of the two friends knew that it would be their last talk. 2 days after this phone call, on November 7, 1989, Katie French called Annie, but she didn't answer. Several days later, Katie received a call from Michael Pollan himself, who said that on November 6th, Annie had broken up with him, gathered her things, and left in an unknown direction. Katie had expected that Annie would call her with a new address, but 2 weeks passed, and on Thanksgiving Day, November 24th, she realized that Annie had been out of touch for 20 days. Katie called all their friends and acquaintances, but no one knew anything. So, she called the police and reported the disappearance of 24-year-old Annie Tahan. However, the operator told her that as a friend, she had no right to report it to the police because she wasn't a blood relative of the missing person. Several months passed, and Annie Tahan still hadn't been heard from. Katie managed to find Michael Pollan's mother's phone number. She called the woman and learned that Annie's youngest daughter, Jade, was with her. Her friend immediately understood that something terrible had happened. She knew that under no circumstances would Annie have left her daughter alone. Soon after, Michael Pollan was transferred to the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii. He showed no interest in the whereabouts of his daughter's mother and didn't rush to contact the police. Several months after Annie Tahan's disappearance, at her mother's request, efforts were finally made to find her. The first person officers interviewed was her partner, Michael Pollan. He became the prime suspect. Michael explained that on the morning of November 6th, he woke up and found that Annie had left the house, leaving their daughter with him. According to him, the night before, Annie had confessed to him that she wanted to break up. Michael didn't look for Annie because he believed that their relationship had ended and they shouldn't have any further contact. He didn't know that she had disappeared and was not in touch with her family and friends. Police searched their rented apartment. They didn't find any traces, evidence, or suspicious items. Annie Tahan's case seemed to be at a standstill. For some reason, mass searches for the young woman hadn't even begun. It was unknown where Annie was, whether she was alive, and what the kidnapper's motive might have been. All that was known was that her last known sighting was with her partner. For a full 4 long years, nobody heard or saw anything about Annie. Her close friend, Katie French, was the only person actively searching for her and cooperating with the investigation. Katie spent around $16,000 on phone bills. She hired a private detective and had no intention of giving up. Katie reached out to various organizations that might help her learn more about Michael Pollan. According to Katie herself, Michael was a very dangerous man, someone not to be trusted. Katie was terrified of him and knew that if her cooperation with the police became known to him, Michael could harm her. In 1993, Annie Tan's case finally saw some progress. This happened when it was transferred to the military's Criminal Investigations Service. The service's personnel started a fresh investigation from scratch. They tracked down Michael Pollan to the Pearl Harbor military base in Hawaii. Military police agents tried to speak with him regarding Annie's disappearance, but he stated that he would only talk in the presence of his lawyer and eventually refused to cooperate with the investigation. Military police agents gathered all the information about the missing woman and contacted the law enforcement agency in South Carolina, asking if there were any matches with unidentified bodies found. The key distinctive feature of Annie was that she had given birth just a month before her disappearance. South Carolina police reported having one unidentified deceased woman who had given birth just a month before her death. They provided a sketch of this woman's appearance, which left the military police agents stunned because they realized they had found Annie Tan. The woman had been brutally murdered, her body discovered on the side of a road in Jasper County, South Carolina, approximately 160 kilometers from the apartment where Annie had lived with Michael. The crime scene photos were horrifying, and the agents admitted they had never seen anything as gruesome. Annie's face had been crushed to just above ear level. The murder was so brutal it defied imagination. Her skull had been shattered into 124 pieces, taking nearly 500 hours to reconstruct. It was known that Annie's body had been placed in a military duffel bag, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. The flaming bag was found at 6 a.m. on November 7, 1989. This was around the same time when Annie's friend, Katie French, reported that Annie had stopped responding to her calls. By comparing Annie Tan's dental records to those of the unidentified woman, the agents confirmed a complete match. Michael Pollan immediately became the prime suspect in the young woman's murder. The military police agents devised a detailed investigation plan. The first thing they checked was Michael's financial transactions, and they discovered that he had used his credit card on the day of Annie's disappearance. He made a purchase 40 kilometers south of where the woman's burning body was found. By examining Michael's phone calls, the agents found that on the morning of November 6th, he made 2 calls to Savannah, his mother's home. The first call was at 4:35 a.m. and the second at 5:17 a.m. The agents began to suspect that he had killed Annie in their apartment and then left her body on the side of the road and set it on fire. The agents decided to locate Michael's former wife, Dawn Breeze, and speak with her. At the time of Annie's death, Dawn was officially married to Michael Pollan and living in his mother's house in Savannah. It was discovered that Dawn had divorced her husband and left Savannah shortly after Annie's disappearance. She spent the next several years living in different states, constantly changing her place of residence. Agents found that at the time, she was living in Miami, Florida. In the summer of 1995, almost 6 years after Annie Tan's murder, agents tracked down Dawn Breeze, Michael Pollan's former wife. At that time, she was involved in spiritual practices and made a living from them. She had started her healing work back in 1987, worked as a masseuse, Tai Chi instructor, and worked with energies. The agents went to work with Dawn Breeze and informed her that they needed to talk to her about Annie Tan's disappearance. She asked how long the conversation would take, as she admitted she was hungry, and if it was going to be lengthy, she'd like to grab a snack. This question slightly surprised the agents because they had expected her to change her demeanor and be unable to contain her emotions when they arrived, telling her they needed to talk about Annie Tan. They thought she might become nervous and shaky, but none of that happened. Dawn had her meal and then proceeded to speak with the military police agents. Their conversation turned into a full-fledged interrogation and lasted a whole 10 hours. Dawn Breeze's story perfectly matched Michael Pollan's testimony. She recounted that when she arrived at Michael's apartment, she immediately saw Annie Tan's body on the floor of the living room. Annie was lying face down. Michael told Dawn to go to the bedroom and meet his daughter. At that time, Michael and Dawn were legally married and had 3 children together. It was in that apartment that Michael told his lawful wife about his affair with Annie. He explained that there was nothing serious between them, but a child had resulted from his affair. He begged his wife to help him by taking the daughter and assisting him in raising her. According to Dawn, Michael didn't want to go to court with Annie over custody. He had planned the murder and chosen what he saw as the easier path. Late at night on November 5th to 6th, 1989, Michael and Annie went to bed together. They were intimate, and when the woman fell asleep, Michael took a sledgehammer and began hitting her with it. Their daughter Jade was lying next to her mother on the bed the entire time. He continued to strike her in the head, blow after blow. Annie proved to be strong and didn't lose consciousness, but she eventually died from the injuries right there in bed. Michael called his wife and asked her to come urgently. After that, he put Annie's body in a military duffel bag and placed it in the trunk of his car. There was a canister of gasoline in the trunk as well. He then put his wife and daughter in the back seat, and they embarked on a long journey. They drove about 160 kilometers, chose a location that seemed suitable to them, and pulled over on the side of the road. Michael took the bag with Annie's body out of the trunk, doused it with gasoline, and set it on fire. Afterward, he immediately got back in the car and drove his wife and daughter back to Savannah, to his mother's house. Don Breeze's confession was a significant breakthrough in the investigation and one of the first crucial pieces of information the agents had received since finding Annie's body. The officers asked Don Breeze to call her ex-husband and engage him in a conversation about Annie Tahan's murder in their presence. She agreed. She called Michael and told him she wanted to have a serious talk because she had learned that Annie, the missing woman, had been found and identified. Michael replied, "No, they didn't." This was a signal to the agents that Don Breeze had told them the truth. Then Don informed the man that blood had been found in the apartment, and because of that, the Maritime Police suspected them of murder. Don said, "You need to come up with an explanation for that blood in the apartment." Michael responded, "Okay, we need to work together and figure something out." Michael didn't make any confessions during the phone conversation. However, he clearly understood what his ex-wife was talking about and didn't ask her any unnecessary questions. He didn't deny anything. It became clear that Annie Tahan had indeed been killed in his apartment. At the end of the conversation, Michael asked Don to be careful and not talk too much on the phone. He stated that they were in this together and would handle it. The agents took Don Breeze to the crime scene in search of any evidence that might have been left behind. Before the trip, they disguised her so that no one would recognize that she was cooperating with the investigation. Inside the apartment, Don Breeze gave a detailed account and showed how Annie's body had been positioned and what happened afterward. She pointed out where there was a significant accumulation of blood. This included the wall, baseboard, carpet, and the concrete floor beneath it. Since Michael had moved out of this rented apartment long ago, the owners had changed and cleaned the carpet several times, so it was not surprising that no traces were found on them. However, when the police sprayed a special substance on the concrete floor, a large purple puddle appeared, indicating the presence of protein traces. This puddle was located exactly where Don had described Annie lying. The blood had literally soaked into the concrete floor. However, the Maritime Police couldn't convincingly prove that what they had found was indeed blood. Therefore, the agents continued their search for additional physical evidence. Don explained that near the bed where Annie was killed, there used to be a TV stand. After the murder, Michael told his wife that the TV was heavily splattered with blood and needed to be cleaned thoroughly. After the crime, Michael eventually got rid of that TV. His wife, Dawn, suggested that he might have sold it, as Michael was a real miser and couldn't bring himself to throw away a working piece of equipment. Searching for the TV was like looking for a needle in a haystack, or more accurately, the haystack itself. The agents decided that they needed to put in every effort to find that TV. By that time, Michael Pollan had learned that the Maritime Police were tracking him. After the call from his ex-wife, he became paranoid and soon discovered that he was being surveilled. The agents were afraid that he might flee, that he could intimidate witnesses, or even seriously harm someone else. During one of the days of surveillance on Michael Pollan, he attempted to escape. The police caught up with him. On October 11, 1995, he was arrested. While Michael was held in military prison on suspicion of murder, the Maritime Police found and interviewed everyone who had lived in the apartment complex in November 1989, where the murder had occurred. 3 months later, the agents found a neighbor who reported that he had bought the TV from Michael, and it was still in his possession and working perfectly. The police confiscated the TV and sent it to the FBI laboratory for analysis. Inside the speakers, they discovered 11 bloodstains that belonged to Annie Tahan. By that time, Michael Pollan's lawyers had stated that he was willing to plead guilty in exchange for the removal of the death penalty. The prosecutor didn't like it, but military law required the deal to be made. In court, Michael Pollan fully admitted his guilt. His face showed almost no emotion, and his narrative sounded as if he were reading a grocery list. There was no hint of remorse or compassion in his words. Michael Pollan was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He was dishonorably discharged from the military. Despite his former wife Dawn Breeze knowing about her husband's crime and remaining silent for 6 years, she managed to avoid punishment because she made a crucial admission to the Maritime Police. Annie's sons and daughter know what happened to their biological mother. They know that she wasn't abandoned. The shared daughter of Annie and Michael, Jade, grew up into a beautiful woman. She was raised in the Pollan family and never had any contact with her father. In 2013, after serving only 17 years in prison, Michael Pollan was released for good behavior. Today, no one knows his exact whereabouts, and anyone near him should be cautious. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe, rate, leave comments, and please take care of yourselves.